Hello, this is our podcast, and this week we'll be talking about Get Out. And first, we're going to discuss the acting and the script and how that impacted the film.
I think the acting especially was like really, really good. Like especially Daniel Kaluuya, like you wouldn't be able to tell that he's not like American. But also just like the way it all felt very like natural, like it felt so real, kind of contributes like when like Georgina or like Harold would be acting weird, like it was so obvious and it felt kind of like a little bit jarring.
Yeah, I agree. The acting was definitely great. I thought that the actress who played Rose and like all her family members, they really were able to portray like the microaggressions that Chris experienced throughout the film, like specifically the scene when he realized everything that was going on and he was asking her for the keys and she was pretending
Yeah,
like she was looking for the keys, but then it's like her whole facial expression kind of changed and you saw
that
who
was
she really was. I thought that was a great scene.
yeah, that was
Yeah,
really
I
like
agree. I think even down to like the minor scale actors and actresses within the film, like for example, the person who, or Lakeith Stanfield, who was in the film just for a short period of time, and also the maid, Georgina, like we talked about earlier, like even though they weren't major characters within the movie, and even like the extras and things like that, everybody kind of was on the same page and was making sure to do their diligence to make sure that the audience and the viewers got a good sense of what was going on at the household.
yeah, that's a really good point actually because when you know that like the auction scene or like before the auction scene where they're at that party, like just the way like all the like people were interacting with him, like
Exactly.
like touching him, like looking at him, like there was this one part where uh his girlfriend was introducing him to like that old man and his wife, and the way she was like grabbing him and then she started like mouthing at her, like the Rose, I think her name was, like she mouthed at her kind of like stop. Like I had definitely missed that before because
Exactly.
like the way she was kind of like don't scare him off or anything. Like I think the way that everybody kind of committed to that role was really good.
And I think that with the maid, and I don't remember his name, but you can really see like just in their facial expressions that something wasn't right. Like I think they do a really good job at portraying like that something's wrong. Like just with their facial expressions, like they didn't even really say much, but you could just like feel the intensity of the scenes.
Definitely.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree with that point. I think at one point, I think one of them even started to tear up. I hope I'm right. Yeah, they started to tear up, and it was not like they were crying. They weren't crying fully, but they were tearing up while they were talking, and you could tell that they were. It was off. It was weird.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really conveyed that like suppressed emotion, like how that's kind of like a sliver of their consciousness or however they described it. That's like making the tears fall, but like the person who's controlling the face is trying to like just smile through it. That was just like really good acting.
Yeah, and like even down to the script writing by Jordan Peele, like obviously the release of Get Out was an extremely um, long awaited event, especially within the Black community from Jordan Peele's history and his previous works of art. So um, I think a different script writer or director wouldn't have been able to encapsulate exactly what Jordan Peele did. And I think it goes to show in many of his other films and ones that just released like Candyman and things like that. Like he has a very distinct way in which he presents his art. So um, I appreciated
Yeah.
that a lot and I got a good sense of his artistry within Get Out.
Yeah, he really captures like the nuance of the situation. Like just Like, because I feel like a lot of movies that would be trying to do something like similar about race, like a lot of them are very like overt. Like it's kind of like the way Get Out had it, like it didn't feel like it was even necessarily, it was like a horror film, but just the way they were like bringing in these different elements, like he's really crazy. But yeah, on the script, um, like a part that I had actually seen it on like Twitter or something, which made me, when I watched it this time, like made me remember it. Like at the beginning, when they hit the deer and then the cop is trying to ask for his ID, um, and like she had been all like, or like his girlfriend had been all like, oh, you don't need his ID, like you don't need to see that. And in the moment you're like, oh, like she's trying to stick up for like her black boyfriend, like she's trying to, keep him from being like unfairly targeted or whatever. But then it actually turns out that she's just trying to keep like any record of him from
That's a
like
good
appearing.
point.
Yeah, that really blew my mind. I was like,
Yeah.
like the fact that Jordan Peele had like planned it out like that, like from the very beginning, like it made it even crazier to rewatch.
Yeah, I think I agree with what everyone was saying about like one of Jordan Peele's like highlights is how he's able to be subtle with it. And it's like you might not catch it on the first time, but when you watch it again, it's like, oh, because as I watched it for the second time, I realized like all of the hints to what was going on, because in the beginning of the movie, when Chris is giving the house a tour, the dad is like, yeah, our basement is closed because of black mold problems. And then later on throughout dinner, the Rose's brother was telling him like, oh yeah, if you really gave into your potential, like you'd be a beast. And it's like all of these like microaggressions. So that was really interesting. But if anyone has any last thoughts on the acting and the script before we move on to the camera work and editing.
Yeah, well, just what you were saying about like the language, like stuff that like honestly feel like white people might have missed when they're watching it, because like the way her dad had been talking about Obama, the way all these white people when they come up to him have been like using this kind of coded language that like is real. Like that's really how like, you know, white people will speak sometimes.
And
So it just felt really realistic.
to add to that, even when the black, I call them the hypnotized black people were speaking, and the main character was interacting with them, he would use slangs and they wouldn't understand him, and he would have to rephrase, and they didn't use any slangs, they spoke where it was obviously a controlled speech, but yeah.
Yeah, it was like they didn't really, that was what kind of clued him in that something was wrong, because they didn't really interact with him like the camaraderie that black people have with each other like wasn't there. So what are your thoughts on the camera work and the editing?
I think that was one of the most important parts within the film. Like the scene that pops into my head off rip is when Daniel Kaluuya, his eyes got like bloodshot red. They were open extremely wide. The tears dropped down his face. Like that was all in the editing. And like when he fell into the teacup or whatever was going on, like that editing was something different that wasn't really done too much in the film. Like we talked about earlier, the film was very like realistic and like made it feel like we were right there with him. But then once all that situation started to go down, like Daniel or Jordan Peele made it a point to kind of break us from that realistic approach and kind of introduce a more fantasy-like situation, which I think only emphasized his desire to make us feel like something was definitely off, and we were about to enter the part of the movie that was very much horror centered.
Yeah, I really agree with that actually, because just the sunken place in general, like the way he switched it, so when he's like falling in, like what you were saying, and then he's like looking out through the screen, but it's almost like into like realism, but he's stuck in this like surreal like void, and it was just so like scary. Like it just really made the whole like mood of it shift. And like before, most of like the camera work I felt like he'd been doing was very like wide establishing shots, or just like when it would be people speaking, it would kind of zoom in, and then it would be like really zoomed in when it would be like a really tense situation, like during the hypnosis, it kept zooming in like closer and closer. And so then to kind of like blow it out like that when he falls through the floor basically, like I think that just really effectively like kind of like shifted it, like you were saying.
I actually have to say that I didn't. It was the opposite for me, kind of, because I didn't feel detached from the scene when he started to sink into the chair. I felt trapped myself based on how the camera was, however they're setting up the cameras. But I felt trapped. I felt I was sinking, and then he'd switch from the sinking to him being there and gripping the chair, and I would catch myself literally holding on to something, because it was just that intense.
Yeah, I think the camera really captures how like uncomfortable certain situations are for Chris, because for me what stood out was whenever he would interact with Georgina or the groundskeeper, it was like it would always zoom in on their face, and it would be this like awkward kind of like silence between them. And that's kind of, it kind of put you on edge. And when they were at that big party, it's like they were able to, like I could feel uncomfortable through the interactions, even though it wasn't happening to me, because it was just like the way they focused in on their faces and like the things they were saying, you could see how uncomfortable he was in those situations.
Like it felt like Jordan Peele wanted us to be like what you were saying with the zoom and everything. It felt like he wanted us to catch like every like kind of flinch and like weird, like just like if their eyes darted away or something, like, or just kind of like the blankness in their eyes, like when they're possessed.
Right.
Like that was, yeah, I thought that was really cool. Or just like disturbing.
Yeah, and if nobody else has anything to say on camera work and editing, we can move on to the costumes and missing scene. What did you guys think about that?
The costumes, the only thing I really noticed, or the only thing that like really stood out to me was like a lot of the muted colors in the like outfits. Like that was kind of like I felt like with the missing scene in general, like the setting was very like meant to be tranquil, which is kind of like contrasting against how like tense the scenes would be. Like even that dinner scene that they had, like the first dinner scene, like it has like this very soft lighting, but it's so like this candlelit lighting, but it's so tense. So it's like this calm setting against an uncomfortable like situation. Like I think they just kept making use of like soft against that like harsher like concept.
One thing that stood out to me was the fact that Georgina, the maid or the housekeeper or whatever, she had a very like vintage style of dress, which now that I think about it, kind of resembled like Miami outfit from like the early 1900s, even back to like some slave reference kind of outfits she had on, as well as that character that Lakeith Stanfield played. But also, one thing that I saw on Twitter before we get out is that y'all remember that scene where that man was running I think, away from the house or past the house or whatever, and it had really spooked out Daniel Kaluuya. Somebody said that that was like a reference at Jesse Owens or whatever, who was kind of like a talking point between um, the father and Daniel in one of the scenes. And I thought that was kind of cool because it made it seem like maybe this wasn't the first Black guy that they had taken. And like, well, we know that it wasn't, but like, that was kind of one of the hints that there were plenty of Black people that this family had taken and had on their property or whatever. It was interesting.
Yeah. And I didn't even think about that until you said something, but like at the beginning when he first gets there and the dad had been talking about how his like grandpa lost the race against Jesse Owens, like for him to be in this new body, like running constantly.
Exactly.
That's weird.
Yeah, that's a good point. I didn't even connect that either. But there's definitely a lot of callbacks to the past and like the way they dress, because one of the things that let him knew that Andre was like weird was because of how he was dressed, and his outfit kind of looked like the Black people that were at the house, everybody's outfits kind of looked like very 1950s, 1960s ish, which allowed it to set the tone. And for like the setting, I don't know about y'all, but like the house, since it was so big and it's like they had this like huge yard, it kind of reminded me of a plantation a little bit.
It definitely gave plantation for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, it did.
Yeah. Well, if nobody has any last thoughts on that, we can move on to the music. What are you guys' thoughts on that one?
I thought the music was one of like, I mean, in every Jordan Peele movie, he has like a very distinct like scratching almost type music that he puts with his horror. But this is kind of where he like started it, I guess. Or maybe I'm just thinking us, but in this one, he had like that like violin noise, like I don't even know how to describe it, like the scratching violin, and how like some of the music he'd have at the beginning, like the Run Rabbit thing was used again when he's trying to escape. Like the song that had been playing during the intro credits, playing again during the end credits. So I thought he made really like interesting use of music with that.
For sure.
Yeah, and like the way the like creepy music, it would like increase in volume and like pace as the scene would get tenser. And then sometimes it would just like cut off. And so you wouldn't even kind of notice it until it was gone. Like when he was at that party and then he walked upstairs and like all the sound stopped and they're all looking up at him. Like I think he just used sound and music to like really mirror like the situation.
Yeah, that scene really stood out to me in the movie too. That was like one of the creepiest scenes, because it was like, and this kind of goes back to the editing too, is the way it cut back and forth from him like walking up the stairs to like them all downstairs in a big group, like just looking and like listening to his every movement. That was definitely a really, really creepy part. And I agree on like the way Jordan Peele uses music, because whenever it was starting to get like things were starting to get off, you could hear the music in the background kind of setting the tone.
Yeah, like I noticed that with the hypnosis scene as well. Like the scraping of like the spoon was increasing. Like when she was talking about the rain, the sound of the rain was increasing. The music was playing, and then it just kept like it would cut off when she was saying like sink, which even just the way they edited like her voice at some points, like the way they distorted certain things, like it was just really, really insane.
Yeah, like in that scene that you're referring to, like after hypnosis and he's like falling into the sunken place, like you can hear like the distorted like string instruments, and it just kind of sounds like I don't know how to explain it. It's just very distorted, and you can just like feel the intensity of like him falling, and like it kind of feels like a nightmare. Like that's just how it kind of how I thought of it. Like it's like very distorted and spooky. So I think he did a very good job at just that music choice in particular, because it really just makes the whole scene more intense.
Definitely.
Yeah, it did. Yeah, I agree with that point. It did feel like a nightmare. It was very intense. And someone has said something about the stopping when the music would stop. And whenever that would happen, I would panic. I'd be like, what's gonna happen next, you know? But yeah.
Yeah, it really helped build like the anxiety about the whole situation. Like it really just keeps you on edge the entire time. And yeah, like I don't know. I feel like he does that, like I said, like in Us, and then I'm sure he did it in Candyman too. But he has like a really good like understanding of how music can kind of like just make the scene more intense and kind of like work to what he's trying to do.
Okay, and lastly, what are you guys' thoughts on the total psychological impact that the film had?
I think that the film basically just kind of like solidified a lot of the feelings that the Black community and just like people of color in general feel in regards to white people sometimes. Like it can be very difficult to trust them and to like be comfortable around them knowing things that have happened in the past or whatever. So for this guy to go, with his supposed to be loved one and his girl or whatever and end up in a situation like this, it just kind of goes to show how obviously not on such an extreme level, but there can be a lot of ulterior motives within some of these relationships that we have with them. And I think that was one of the main points that Jordan Peele wanted to articulate. And just like the whole interracial relationship thing in general, like regardless of your individual feelings in regards to it, like there's always that thought in the back of your mind, like what's really going on here? Like, is there more to this story? So that's kind of the key points that I took away from it.
Yeah, like that scene where he had been like telling her about like what happened to his family, and she's like listening to him and like pretending like she's empathizing with him, and the entire time she's planning on like harvesting his body basically. And just overall, like the way like they all casually treat him as if he's like an object. Like she's kind of like, oh, you were my favorite one, or like the way they'll be grabbing him and talking about like him as like a specimen almost. And it was just really interesting.
Yeah, I agree. I think the film really highlighted how racism isn't always like overt, and it isn't, I feel like a lot of times there's a stereotypical like image of racism where it's like this like redneck type, like it's loud and in your face. But with Get Out, I think he was able to portray how you can be like liberal or progressive and still be racist, because I liked how he made it a point to add in like, oh, my dad will vote for Obama a third time if he could. And it's like, it really showed how racism is more covert than we would really think.
Yeah, and how that like covert racism can be like more dangerous, honestly, because like led him to feel like led him to think that he could trust this woman and that like she'd be different or his family would be different or like she'd be on his side. And it was
Right.
just like yeah, I really like how Jordan Peele had made a point of like basically every like white character in that movie that he was interacting with, like none of them were like redeemable. Like even the blonde guy that he was talking to, like that's the only one he was making a connection with at the event. And then that's the one that ended up trying to buy him.
Yeah, that was a really powerful point because he met him towards the end of the party where he had already experienced all of those comments from the other white people. And he thought he had
Yeah.
something in common with them because of his art background. And then that turned out to be the man who was literally trying to steal his body. So that was a powerful,
Mhm,
powerful point.
mhm.
All right. Does anybody have any last thoughts before we close out?
Well, just like on the psychological impact in general, I feel like it changes based on what ending you're watching. Like, because with the original ending, or like the one where his friend comes and picks him up in the police car, like it almost feels like hopeful, kind of like he went through all this like terrible stuff, but he still had like hope, kind of, that he could at least get out of the situation. But then in the ultimate ending, where it's the police come and like they take him to jail, and he's just kind of like resigned to this, like this is better than the situation he was in at their house, but still like just indicative of like a larger problem overall. Like I think that, it kind of changes depending on the ending. So I kind of like how he like gave us two versions of it.
Yeah, I agree. The endings definitely change, like it impacts the entire view of the movie because I enjoyed that the ending was kind of like an optimistic one. Because after all of that, it's like we're used to in those types of movies getting like a kind of dark and sad ending. So I enjoyed that.
Yeah, it was really like satisfying almost to see him get all this, like he was able to get, revenge on everybody that had been doing stuff to him. And then he didn't even, like, his friend came and picked him up. And so it just felt like that was the way it should have been for him.
Yep, I agree. All right. So any last thoughts? No, that's it. Okay. And that's the end of our podcast. Thank you for listening.